super great, and I'm going to just be raw with you all because I think that's super important that we're going to have this conversation about race and racism in the US. We need to be true to how we're feeling, right? And so I'm feeling, as the kids right now are saying, a type of way. So I'm hoping that tonight we are going to have a really good discussion afterwards, but I'm going to try to lay some groundwork about a couple of things. Back in August, Christina ended up reaching out about having a discussion about racism in some key terms that people are sometimes stumbling across about what do they mean and what are we seeing in the media, what are we seeing in the news, and all that. So I'm hoping that I can do that with you all tonight. But what I'm going to do is share my screen. That way, if you are a visual person, you can kind of follow along with me. So let's see here. Can everyone see that? We're looking good? All right. Perfect. I know that Christina said that the best way to be able to view this would also be if you did like the speaker view, so that way you can get a full screen of it, and then you would be able to see me in the corner. All right, so to get started, one of the, where I'd like to start is to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about racism. Where did this kind of start, and why is it still here, right? Some people are questioning, like, well, racism, isn't that supposed to be over from like the civil rights? And that's, no, absolutely not. It's still here. It's still alive. If anything of this week could possibly indicate that it's still here, I think that this is an opportune moment to have this conversation. We're going to go over some terminology. What's some politically correct terms? What are you reading about? What are you hearing in the news? And then I'm hoping to be able to provide you with some resources to continue the learning, because in all honesty, having the conversation about race and racism is not an hour-long conversation. This is truly something to start the conversation, to know where to go from here, and also to create a sense of network within our alma mater of who can we reach out to and keep in touch with when we're having these conversations and knowing where to go through next. And then hopefully we'll have a question and answer session towards the end where you can be able to ask some questions afterwards. So a little bit about me. My name is Amanda Lynn DaCosta Wagner. I identify as Latina. I am cisgendered, cisgender female, which means that my sex and my sex and my gender align. They are the same. I am originally from Dartmouth, Massachusetts. So if anyone's from Massachusetts, shout out. But I'm originally from Dartmouth. I moved around a lot as a kid, moved to Chester, New Hampshire, moved back down to Dartmouth, and then moved over to Springfield to join Western New England and spent one of my 4 best years of my life over there. And then after I ended up getting my bachelor's in political science, I decided that I wanted to work in higher education, working with college students. So I went to Syracuse, New York, to Syracuse University, get my master's in higher education administration, which is just a fancy terminology of saying that you're looking at college student development. That program at Syracuse was really eye-opening for me for multiple reasons. Throughout my life, I knew that I was different. I knew that I was Latina, and I didn't necessarily fit in with the crowds that I was a part of, considering I grew up in a very white town, and I went to very white schools, predominantly white schools throughout my life. But I didn't really understand why I had this disconnect until I went to my master's program. My master's program focused on student development, particularly in the college level, college career, and it focused on how your identities influence the way that you process information, the way that you get access to education, the way that you get access to healthcare. Everything in life is related back to the multiple identities that you have, whether it's your sexual orientation, your gender, your sex, your race. All of it intertwines together, or intersects, as Kimberly Crenshaw ended up coining. That is all like super important. So that led me into this passion of understanding a little bit more about myself, understanding a little bit about the students that I work with, but also adjusting my lifestyle and realizing that I need to be more inclusive in the things that I'm doing, and realizing that there are pockets of people that do not have the same privilege, and what am I doing about it? So my whole professional career has been around diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Even though I've been in residential life and admissions, I've found a way to intertwine that with whatever I'm doing. I even put it into my personal life. So my daughter is 3 years old. It's specifically a gender neutral name in case she ended up growing up and realizing that her sex and her gender doesn't align. She has one less problem to worry about later on. So that's just a sample of like some of the stuff that I do in my life. So that's a little bit about me. This year though, I ended up starting an LLC. and this LLC is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, predominantly for higher education, but it transcends all years, all generations. And so I started it because of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter in May. And I say resurgence because it's been around for a while. It's not a new concept. And so they came back and they are at full force and they have not let up because we can't. And I think that that's important. And that's the reason why this conversation is here today, is because Black Lives Matter and other movements around identity are going to continue pushing forward. And I think that we all need to better understand what's happening and the impacts, whether or not you identify with that community. So let's get started, shall we? So to kind of give a little bit of history, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about history today with you all. And the reason why is because that's kind of the point, is that sometimes our history that we have been taught is missing things. And I say sometimes because it really depends on what part of the nation you've been growing up in and where you were that influences your education. And so when I'm talking about here, we're going to start off when we're talking about Black Lives Matter. And for the sake of today's topic, we are very much talking about race, and we are very much talking about Black Lives Matter movement. I'm not touching upon Asian Americans. I'm not touching upon Latinos. I'm very much talking about what is transcending right now within our country that is extremely important. And so I want to make sure that that's a focus, that we're not, I don't intentionally want to exclude anybody, but I think that we really need to do justice and talk about the Black community right now. So it starts off with like slavery. Well, technically it starts off way before that, but I'm going to start off with slavery. And slavery started roughly between around 1525. And I say roughly because some historians debate when it truly started. But between that period of 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million slaves were kidnapped. Granted, 10.7 made it through the journey. And I think that that's extremely important to mention because we lose a lot of folks because of that process of moving across the ocean. We lost folks because of diseases. We lost folks because of the cramming and the packing. And I don't know whether or not our history lessons truly talked about the harshness of the treatment of human beings during that process. I reflected in my own experience whenever I learned about all this stuff again, when I was in my master's program. And I did not learn all of the details because we sugarcoat things for children. And I think that was doing a disservice by not truly expressing the hardships that Black African-American slaves experienced coming over. They did not have any rights. They did not have any human rights, to be honest. And I'm struggling to say this because I think like it's supposed to be challenging to talk about this stuff, right? And so when they come overseas, the reason why that they were brought overseas was because of economics, right? They wanted to be able to have more folks to be able to do more economic work, to be able to be in the fields, to be able to pick cotton, pick whatever the particular cane, whatever it was at that in those particular areas. Transatlantic slave was between Europe, Africa, and the Americas and back. And it was considered a trade where you would trade goods for humans, humans for goods, goods back to Europe. And that's where we start. Now, we think about Black history within school, and we think about what we're learning. And the textbooks that when we learn about Black history, which is ironic in and of itself, let's think about that. We have to differentiate the United States history between Black history and our regular history. Why do we do that, right? Like that should have raised some red flags when we are in school. Why is there a difference? Why do we dedicate a month, right? Shouldn't it be all year that we're learning it? Shouldn't it be integrated through the entire curriculum? So whenever we're talking about history, at least I'm reflecting on my own experience. I'm reflecting on individuals that I know that teach. Oftentimes they're giving positive imaging, right? Or whenever they do talk about something that is negative, they try to lessen the harshness because they want to try to preserve that innocence in children, correct? But we need to think about the fact that let's say, for instance, if we're talking about the Black community, Black families are having very challenging conversations with their children regardless because of some of the things that they're facing. So why should we not be having these conversations with our children in the classroom about history that happened, to talk about what aggression has happened and what hasn't? So the example that I give, and I have this on the screen here, is the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850 was around the concept of slavery, but also the acquisition of land. So Texas wanted to get more land from Mexico, and there was a debate about who could control it. Would those new territories be able to be pro-slavery or anti-slavery? What did that look like? And so that was done. It essentially, people are like complimenting the Compromise of 1850 because it prolonged the Civil War. But that's like the lesser of two evils, right? That compromise did not, like, it might have prolonged a war, but at the same time, it strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, which then required even those that were anti-slavery states, they required them to return escaped slaves back. That's not a compromise. That's an appeasement. And so the way that we phrase certain things throughout our history shows a level of racism. And so I think that that is the concept that we have here when we talk about history in our school system, is that the phrasing of our history, what we choose to share, illustrates systemic racism within education. And so the other concept too is about Emancipation Proclamation. I give this as another example on the screen here. That was signed and delivered on the first of the year in 1863. By the time it reached the entire nation at that time, it took until June 19th, 1865. That took over 2 years, 2.5 years. Now, some people will say, like, oh, well, they didn't have modern and was celebrated everywhere and was truly through the entire country. And so you don't celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation on the first of the year, you celebrate it on, which is June 9th. So that's a little bit about our history, right? So I talked a little bit about this whole positive aspect. When you take a look at the history that we learn, what do we learn about in terms of Black figures and Black leaders? We might learn about, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman. But do we learn about Henry Black leaders that were taken advantage of? Sometimes not. We also don't learn in our history in school about the different types of protests and the different types of leaders that articulate their message. For me, growing up, I was always told that MLK was the peaceful protester, which, let me tell you, there is no such thing as a peaceful protest. They're not supposed to. They're supposed to disrupt. But you then end up learning that Malcolm X was not. And they always portrayed them as two polar opposite people. And that is super incorrect in doing so. Because while one was more forthcoming with their information and didn't mind stepping on some toes, they both were very strong leaders and often shared the same message. They just shared it differently. And we did not get caught, or at least I'm going to go off of my own experience and what I've been told from other friends. That is not being articulated in the curriculum. Other things that are not being shared in the curriculum is all of this stuff. Now, I'm not going to go through and explain each and every one, because I think that I'd be doing a little bit of a disservice here by just doing a history lesson. But I highly recommend you looking them up. Understanding that there was a poll tax that prevents people from being able to get to the polls and be able to utilize their rights. So yes, we gave you the rights to vote, but now we're going to have this poll tax. We're now going to put these voting restrictions on here. We're going to make sure that the voting times are only between these times now. That Black folks were able to fight in world wars, but then they come back and they can't use the same water fountains. They can't sit in the same counters. They're segregated in all other ways, but yet they can risk their lives for a country that they're not supposed to be equals in. It baffles me that we don't talk about that enough. also did not learn about the loving family, which is the interracial marriage case. It was Loving versus Virginia. You don't learn about that either. And why not? That's something that we should be celebrating, right? That is empowering, and that's about love, and that's about the freedom to love who you want to, and yet we don't talk about it. We sometimes skim over Jim Crow, but we don't actually go over, like, well, why is it called Jim Crow? Where did that come from? Jim Crow comes back from the 1800s during slavery, when white actors would wear blackface and portray themselves as Black people. Jim Crow is another word for a Black person. You also talk about redlining. There's also segregation. The other thing that also baffles me is that we don't talk about the racial violence that actually happens inside this country. You talk about these large wars that happen, and then as a child, you just think that wars happen between us and other people in other countries. But we don't talk about the wars that happen at home. And I think that that's doing a disservice to our children, because we are not educating them on understanding that there are differences that are happening in our country, and we are just letting history repeat itself over and over and over again. So I give you a couple of examples, right? I give Colfax Massacre. That was in Louisiana, and that was about 150 people that ended up getting murdered at that time. 3 of them were white, the rest were Black. Tulsa Race Massacre. I threw this one on here because my husband also was like, that was real, like that actually happened. He thought that was just something that the Watchmen made up in the HBO show. So I definitely threw that on here because I needed to make sure that that was a point that, nope, that's a real thing in history, where Black Wall Street was burned down. And I'm not going to go over all the details. I think that you need to look that up yourself. Also, the count is somewhere in the 200s of people that ended up dying during the Race Massacre. East St. Louis Race War, murder of Emmett Till, Orangeburg Massacre. These are just a few of the cases that have happened in our country. So I highly recommend that you end up taking a look at that. I ended up going on the Smithsonian magazine that they ended up posting a lot of different examples there. So I found that that was a really good resource, and they also tagged other folks too that can be able to highlight a little bit more on that. So feel free to utilize that as a resource. So going over a couple of different terms here, we're hearing a lot right now about anti-racism. And a lot of that is because of Ibram I'm so sorry, folks. Ibram Kendi. He ended up writing several books. This latest one is the one I think that is hitting the ground running right now, but Stamped from the Beginning. Those are all really good texts that he's been a part of that all kind of build off of each other. But anti-racism, the concept of anti-racism is talking about a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas. Essentially, that's a quote directly from his book. But essentially what he is boiling it down to is that to be truly anti-racist means that you have to be against racism every day. And that it's something that you are constantly working towards every day. And it's a journey. His book was fantastic. It broke anti-racism up between different identities. So talking about anti-racism in regards to culture, in regards to behavior, in regards to body type, all of that, and understanding the concept of race, breaking it down between all of those, and it really unpacks it a lot. So I highly recommend that read. It's really, really good. Another one, which is a little bit challenging to talk about considering Tuesday's debate, but is white supremacy. So prior to this week, white supremacy, technically, I'm going to go back a hot second. Prior to, I would say, since the 2016 election, white supremacy has been largely known to be back from like what was being done 50 to 60 years ago, right? And they were talking about how it's the KKK and it's about lynchings. White supremacy isn't just about the KKK. There is a site, and I'm going to share it in the chat. I'm going to share the link with you all that provides you with a hate map. And I can't remember the name of the organization right now. I have to like look it up real quick. But they provide you with a hate map. They have over 940 different hate groups in the United States. 940 hate groups. Now, those hate groups are broken down by anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant. anti-women. There's a variety of different neo-Nazi. There's a variety of different types of hate groups. White supremacy is listed there as well. And I think that honing in on that and being able to understand that white supremacy can have multiple meanings. White supremacy is talking about these large groups, such as like the KKK, that is doing violent crimes and violent behavior. But then you also have white supremacy on a lower level, which happens on a day-to-day basis, where folks believe that being white isn't a problem and that it should be celebrated, and that there isn't a difference between being white or any other race. It is people who believe that there isn't any problems. They get very defensive when you talk about race instead of being open-minded. That is what we are talking about modern day white supremacy. It is about the underlying racism that happens because we choose not to learn and we choose not to listen. And so that is, I wanted to give that distinction because I think sometimes folks just think that white supremacy is just the KKK. It's not. There is a lot of groups that are out there, Proud Boys being one of them. And so I think that it's extremely important that we understand that it's evolved over time, just as all other terms in our country has evolved over time. A few other terms here to kind of unpack. Implicit bias. To be honest, I don't really like utilizing the term implicit bias, and I'll explain why in a minute. So the definition of implicit bias, which is from the Kerwin Institute, from the study of race and ethnicity, it ends up referring to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. The reason why I don't like utilizing implicit bias is because it takes the blame off of what is happening. Implicit bias is still bias regardless of what it is. So yes, sometimes you might be doing something unconsciously because you are unaware. So for example, I am an able-bodied person. I have no problem using stairs. I have no problem using any kind of door. I never have to think about it. I know that that's a bias that I have that I don't think about. So if I'm running an event on my college campus, I have to physically make myself think about, okay, great, I have this all planned. Now, is it accessible to everybody? And you have to do that. That's how you beat over your bias, right? So I don't like using implicit bias because I think that it numbs the whole point, and it's like, oh, well, I didn't realize I was doing it. Okay, maybe that one time you didn't realize that you did it, but if you do it again, it's no longer implicit, it's no longer unconscious, it's just bias. Privilege. Privilege is talking about the unearned access to resources, which is within a social power, that are only readily available to some people because of their social group membership. Privilege is often talked about in terms of race, and there is Peggy McIntyre. I think it's McIntyre. I'm like drawing a blank today on names. I'm so sorry, everybody. Peggy McIntyre, she ended up writing an amazing article that talked about unpacking your backpack and being able to unpack your privilege. And she talked about it from her own lens as a white woman. And she ended up listing 50 different things that she could do every day and knows that she has privilege because of being white. I highly recommend looking her up and looking up the unpacking privilege, because that is an excellent exercise to kind of go through to realize, all right, out of the 50, how many of them apply to me? The higher the number, the more privilege you have. Prejudice. This is talking about the unjustified or incorrect attitude, usually negative, towards an individual based solely on the individual's membership of a social group. And it relates back to the whole implicit bias. Prejudice is essentially being able to say incorrect or having incorrect attitude, unjustified attitudes, because someone might be Black or someone might be white, or someone might be Latino, or whatever the case may be. That would be a prejudice. Defund the police has been a very hot topic since at least May, if not before. And the ACLU does an amazing job defining this, because one of the things that I think is extremely important is that you need to do your research. Defund the police, according to the ACLU, is listed below. And so it says that expressing that the movement is calling for a reallocation of funds to the community, improvement of programs, less money spent on militarizing the police. At no point is defunding the police saying that we need to get rid of the police department completely. It is saying that they are being overfunded but also underutilized. They're being thrown into situations that they are not trained for. A barber has more training than a police officer. If someone it has to go for more training to hold a pair of scissors, but not more training to be able to hold a gun, that is a problem. And so we are talking about the whole concept of defunding the police is talking about, let's provide some more resources. Let the appropriate people go and de-escalate certain situations with backup in case situations happen, but let's do some more community building. Let's build the community instead of fighting against the community. Oh, I just need to take a break for a quick second, sorry. Microaggressions. So microaggression means it is a comment or an action that is subtle and often unconsciously or unintentionally expressed, a prejudiced attitude towards a member of a marginalized group. I see this actually a lot within higher education, and I see this a lot within everyday lives too. If my mom goes and we're walking through the mall or we're doing what have you, she'll often talk to me in Spanish. And if people meet her for the first time and she's speaking Spanish, and then she like turns over and starts talking English, she often gets told, "Oh, you speak English so well." That comment doesn't need to be made. I'm like, okay, great. How do you know English isn't her first language? She just picked up Spanish. Like, she has an accent, but it's not that heavy. Other microaggressions that could happen too is talking about, for instance, actually I've been seeing this a lot on Instagram from college students. College students are getting into awkward roommate situations right now because roommates are categorizing Asian Americans as causing the coronavirus. So there's been tweets and there's been things posted about how Asian American students are experiencing this sense of microaggression where like their friends will often say like, "Oh, you have to keep further away from me because you have coronavirus," because they're Asian. And so that's also another sense of a microaggression. I want to take a quick second to just talk a little bit about the difference between equality, equity, and justice. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because actually this actually came from a conversation that I was having with my dad the other day, because we were talking about, it was political, unfortunately, but we were talking about politics, and he was talking about how like equality is needed and everyone like deserves equal rights. And I actually interrupted him and I said that equality isn't going to fix it. Equality is not going to fix the issues that we have. So these images below explain the reasons why, right? So in that first image of equality, you have a soccer game that's being played. Technically, the soccer game is being played in all of them, right? And then there is this wall that is preventing folks from being able to watch the game. Equality means that every person gets the same resources. So if you notice in equality, the taller person uses the box and they can see the game. The middle person is a little bit shorter and uses the box, now they can see the game. But that one box for the shortest person there, it's not enough. It doesn't provide them with enough to be able to see the game. Equity is talking about the allocation of resources based on need. That tall person didn't need a box to begin with. They could see the game just fine. The middle person needed just one box. Now they could see the game. And then the shorter person needed two boxes in order to see the game. Now you have equity. Resources are allocated based off of need. Everyone can be able to have access. Justice goes even further. Justice doesn't look about, oh wait, what resources are needed. It looks at the barrier. Justice is saying, okay, this is creating a barrier. Let's get rid of the barrier. Now you don't need to worry about the extra resources. I think that that's really important because we have these conversations and you're hearing a lot about the news about systemic racism and how ingrained it is in a lot of our society, in different parts of our society. And some folks are saying like, well, we need to treat everybody equally. But in reality, that's not going to fix the problem because not everybody needs the same resources. And we really need to be looking at what are the barriers that are preventing people from getting this access and how do we go about eliminating that? A couple of ways to continue the learning. I know that I'm just setting the ground floor and I know that you probably have a lot of questions. And this is just to kind of spark you in a direction to start moving into learning more about it. Take a minute to reflect on yourself, in figuring out the best way that you take in information. Is it reading? If it is, there's plenty of books out there that you can be able to pick up to be able to learn. I have 2 of them on the screen. So you want to talk about race and why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? I also had Ibram Kendi's book earlier that you could be able to look. Maybe it's podcasts. Maybe you should listen to Code Switch, which has been around for years. I'm going to say it's going on 8 or 9 years now that they've been around, and they have been talking about race the entire time. You can also watch documentaries if you're more into watching something. Highly, highly recommend the documentary 13th. It talks about mass incarceration, and I think that does a really, really good job at highlighting the history behind it and understanding where we're at now. But there's plenty more. There's like Central Park 5, both a documentary as well as a movie series, and I believe they're both on Netflix. But there's a lot of different resources. I know that Netflix ended up creating an entire section dedicated to like Black Lives Matter and being able to increase your knowledge. So I would tap into that if you can. But there's plenty of other things as well. One of the things that I would challenge yourself if you are someone who's on social media, because I know we have multiple generations here, you're on social media. I highly recommend diversifying your feed, which means start following folks that you normally wouldn't follow. Maybe follow some folks that are leaders in these movements, because I think it's incredibly important that we don't stop the learning. I think it's okay if you need to take a minute of self-care to process the information that you're learning because it's so new, but we cannot stop the work. And honestly, like today, I wanted to make sure that I add a call to action. When I first developed this presentation, it was strictly going to be just about, here's some facts, here's ways to learn, let's chat. But I'm going to challenge you all as participants. You joined this for a reason. Do not stop the learning here, and don't stop at just learning. There are so many different ways that you can get involved, whether that is like joining a committee in your town, whether that's letting your voice be heard in your town council, whether it's talking to your alumni, right? And being like, we need more of this. Like, we want to learn more of this. Whether it is, I don't know, giving, donating to an organization that is empowering you. We need to do more. And we need to learn more from each other and listen. So that was my call to action to you all, is finding ways that you can be able to utilize this in your lives. If you have children, diversify their learning. Look at ways that you can be able to help them understand what racism is at a young age. My daughter's bookshelf is completely diverse. We have books that have characters that are gender neutral. We have books that are about Black children. We have books that have multi languages in them. I have Spanish only. I have Portuguese books. I think it's incredibly important that we immerse them in as much culture as we can, regardless if it identifies with your own. And so that is just some suggestions that I have for you all. I do want to open it now to be able to have some questions. I put this picture up here, Passion led us here, because you all are here for a reason. I'm very interested to know why you chose to attend tonight. And I'm hoping that this sense of community between the 30 of us that are here, that we can have some really good conversations, get some questions out there. By no means am I an expert. By no means I'm talking about the Black community, but I am not Black, I am Latina. And so I cannot tell you exactly what it feels like to be a part of that community, but I would be doing a disservice if we don't have this conversation and join as allies to talk about this. So let's open